So welcome to 3L at the Texas Conference on Digital Libraries. Presentations in this session include Stop Storming and Start Performing, Developing a DAMs using Scrum, and the ISO Bank project. My name is Tabo Tang. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a program coordinator at the University of Texas Libraries in Austin and a member of the TCDL Planning Committee. I'm pleased to be your session moderator today. First, some housekeeping. Texas Digital Library and the TCDL Planning Committee are dedicated to providing an experience for everyone that is free from all forms of harassment and inclusive of all people. We ask that everyone here today be considerate and respectful in speech and action, attempt collaboration before conflict, refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in speech, and be mindful of your environment and of your fellow participants. You can also view our code of conduct on the homepage of the conference. This session will run approximately till 3:50. Please feel free to take breaks as you need. I invite you to say hello and chat and let us know where you're joining from, share resources, and make comments throughout today's presentations. We're also encouraged to post your questions in the Q&A section, where you can also vote on other questions that you'd like our speakers to answer. I will be watching for your questions in Q&A and share them with our speakers after both presentations. And now on with the show. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Darrell Jones from the University of Houston. I will hand things over to you now to get started.
Thank you very much, Tao. Thank you all for being here today. Gonna go ahead and get this party started. So, stop storming and start performing, developing a DAMs using Scrum. So, please advance the slide. I'm going to start off with a little bit of a definition, a few definitions, and then I'll move into our overview. So, forming, the team is created and then it comes together. Storming. So storming is a team, the team is working together for the first time, figuring out how to work together, usually where disagreements happen. We're just trying to figure out what's going on, how we all communicate, how we all work, what we do in our positions. Norming is when the team is getting used to working together and getting comfortable with one another. The norming and the storming kind of happen together, but eventually we get to normal operations and we can actually move forward. And then finally, our favorite part is the performing. The team works together and quickly adapts to changes and knows how to work out issues together quickly. And so for our overview, today we're going to be talking about 4 main aspects of this work: Scrum, digital collections management, and changes over time, as well as lessons learned and next steps. And so in terms of lesson learned, I would definitely say that a pandemic is a very good way to get a lot of digital library migration done. And as we move through these slides, you will begin to see how we were able to truly turn a dumpster fire of a vat of lemons into delicious lemonade. And so that is what we're going to be covering today. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Please utilize the chat and let us know if you have any questions. We do hope that you enjoy our presentation, and we also hope that the methodology that you're going to be learning about today or hearing more about in the context of the DAMs is helpful to you in your institution. And at this time, I would like to hand over things to Sean.
Thanks, Darrell, for that wonderful overview. So I wanted to kind of go and take a few minutes to kind of talk about our adaptation as a team into this Agile space and describe to you exactly what the framework we used called Scrum is. During the early stages of development, our DAMs ecosystem, we do a lot of things what projects and people do when we start out. We take a more traditional project management approach, more or less a waterfall approach. We set projections, risks, identify all the parts and try to place them all together. We put them in a big Gantt chart to hope that we can predict exactly what's going to happen and when. In our case, we quickly found out that risks often come with many, many parts that were just too big for us to accomplish at any given time. And plus also relying on communities that were just beyond our control, as many of our stuff in the background relied on those communities and projects that they had separately. So we needed to manage a way to better adapt over time and give us the ability to change as we had more information become available and our environment changes. Agile seemed to fit that bill, but we needed to know exactly what Agile was and how we work as a team. It all starts with Agile centering around the team itself. And Agile has a good group of settings that are expressed in the Manifesto of Agile Solution Development. It should be noted that this is normally called the Agile software development, as Agile did come from software development. However, that has expanded over time, and now you can replace the word software with anything you'd like. In our case, we use solution. With this manifesto that we all take to heart, the team is able to center around each other to move forward. We value things like individuals and interactions over processes and tools, as it is the individuals that we all work together with. We center around working solutions over comprehensive documentation. We found that a lot of documentation to describe the work that we want to do often results in starting all over again, because we're basing that off of assumptions instead of actually working solutions. Documentation will later come out of what we know to work. We have collaboration over contract negotiations. Negotiation often has a negative word to it, as somebody has to give up something. In this space, we want to collaborate to move together for a common goal. And of course, responding to change over simply following a plan. As we all may know, once we have a plan laid out and we get going, if it fails, we often have to start again. But many frameworks take you on that path of agile teams. And so from here, we needed to figure out exactly which one best fit our team and our project. This is where Scrum comes into play. Looking at Scrum, it has a solid framework and a set of roles and structures needed to start a team down an agile path. The first thing is, of course, the 3 pillars of Scrum, as you can see here. We rely on transparency amongst the team and our stakeholders, because visibility ensures that the processes that we do can have a positive outcome. We constantly inspect one another, timely checks on the progress towards a simple goal to determine any variance or problems along the way. This inspection allows us to then take on adaptation, adjusting the process as soon as possible to minimize any further deviation or issues. But this is just the beginning. There's much more to Scrum. Scrum also has a set of values that the team also works on. We have the focus. We focus on a few things at a time, and we work together to produce a lot of work quicker. We have the courage. We're not alone in this team, and we feel supported enough to undertake great challenges. We're, of course, open to one another. We work together and we express how we're doing to improve honestly and quickly. We have commitment. Because we have great control over what we want to do and where we're going, we become much more successful to that commitment. And of course, respect. We work together. We share successes, we share failures, and we come to respect and build upon one another. Lastly, I do want to talk about the Scrum framework itself and the roles and the events that happen within Scrum. Scrum provides three main roles to make the work move forward. First, we have the product owner, who's accountable for maximizing the value of the product with stakeholders and managing the effectiveness of the product backlog, which is a simple set of items of work that needs to be done for the team. We have a Scrum Master who is accountable for establishing Scrum and helping everyone understand the Scrum theory, of which I am talking about now, and the team's effectiveness and enabling the team to improve its practices over time. And then lastly, the developers themselves. These are the people committed to the work and the solutions in creating the increment sprint. Lastly, we have the events, and these are the things that bring all of it together. The sprint itself, it is a fixed length of time necessary to achieve the product goal. It all starts with sprint planning, which initiates the sprint and lays out the work to perform for the sprint. The result plan is created collaboratively by the entire team, resulting in, of course, the sprint backlog, which is another artifact of Scrum. While the sprint is happening, we have a daily Scrum. This is a 15-minute inspection of progress towards that sprint goal and adapt as necessary, adjusting the planned work out within the Scrum. What results from the sprint itself is the sprint review, where we actually analyze and inspect the outcome of the sprint that we have just done to determine any future adaptations to that. Results are also presented to our key stakeholders through the product increment, the last Scrum artifact. And then lastly, at the end of the sprint, we also have a sprint retrospective. This inspects the team and plan ways to increase the quality and effectiveness of the team itself. I should also note that although Scrum doesn't make you agile, it does set you on the path to becoming an agile mindset team. And establishing Scrum was a critical achievement in order to reach many of our goals. To talk more about some of these goals, I will pass it on to Bethany.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sean. So going off those concepts of Agile and Scrum, I will talk about the digital collections ecosystem that we have been building together using this project management framework. So this is the outline of the tools and workflow of the BCDAMS ecosystem. Some of y'all may recognize this from previous years at TCDL, but of course, this is the latest current iteration. We have been refining and improving our processes constantly along the way. But to explain a little bit of what's going on in the diagram, we basically have our three repositories, Archivematica for digital preservation, ArchivesSpace for finding aids, and Armon and Avalon for digital access. These are all of the open source repositories that UH has decided to use to manage our digital content. But in order to implement all these systems and actually migrate off of CONTENTdm, we also had to create all of the supporting tools and workflows that are represented by the red boxes and the arrows in the diagram. So I won't go through the entire workflow right now. Instead, I'll focus on a few elements that really benefited from working through the Agile methodology. But if you have questions about this diagram, we can definitely get to those in the Q&A. So first up, digital preservation. When we started the BCDAMS team, we didn't have a digital preservation system at all. We were implementing Archivematica for the first time from scratch. So there have definitely been some changes to our approach to digital preservation that we worked through together over time. As we evolved our understanding of Archivematica and how it could work together with the other systems to achieve our digital preservation requirements. And many of those changes took place in the workflows. So through the course of the project, we identified decision points when we need to send files and metadata to preservation storage. To illustrate how this has really changed, when we first started out, we initially envisioned that we would send an entire digital collection as one package in the preservation storage. But after some testing and troubleshooting in Archivematica, we discovered that those packages were just too large, and it was not working at all. But with the Agile approach, we were able to adapt to that quickly by deciding that we would put one digital object per package. So, you know, there are situations where a digital object happens to be an entire book or manuscript, and it's still hundreds of files. So by putting one digital object at a time, it allows us to be a lot more flexible with the file management and preservation. Okay. So over the course of the BC Dams project, we also implemented ArchivesSpace. This system allows us to manage our archival collections, and it presents the public user interface to the finding aids. And ArchivesSpace is also where we store and correlate the unique identifiers for preservation objects and access objects. So we knew that we wanted to be able to reference the preservation URI in the access system and in ArchivesSpace, in case we ever needed to retrieve that object from the preservation storage. And so by having people from special collections, that's me, and digitization and metadata all together on the team, we had all of these different perspectives, and we were able to really carefully think through the process of completing a big digitization project to determine exactly when in the process we need to mint the identifiers to have them be posted to ArchivesSpace correctly and have them available in all the systems. So with that, I will hand it over to, I believe, Laura.
Yes, thank you, Bethany. As already mentioned, there have been many changes and improvements to the project, but the team itself has also gone through changes, and some members have left. Others have come in and adopted new roles, with myself being the newest addition. The pandemic brought one major change in the past year. We moved our face-to-face meetings to Zoom and began using remote desktop connections. In this way, we have been able to maintain and even increase our productivity. Due to the Scrum Framework, all of our stories, tasks, and workflows were already set up and planned out with the help of the project management tools you see here. In Taiga, we maintain the project backlog where migration tasks or stories are added and sized according to estimated difficulty. In Miro, during sprint planning, the team continues to plan out stories and components that are pulled into the sprint. This helps each team member visualize their own commitments and those of the rest of the team, and helps us to not overcommit. These tasks are broken down into a checklist and added into Asana. Here we assign tasks to each member as we work our way through each step of the process during the sprint. We use Slack for our daily communications, updates, requests, handoffs, or any other chats that are relevant to our tasks and projects. And finally, we use Google Drive to maintain collaborative documents such as spreadsheets, project plans, and notes on collections. These tools have helped us optimize our processes, but it is the team that does the problem solving itself. And here's Cheryl to talk a little bit more about how we do that.
Thanks, Laura. So just a bit more about the individual tools. You know, there was a time that we were determining as a group which tools we would use and which tools we would retire. and we were able to find a balance together through talking in backlog refinements and through daily stand-ups to determine which tools were going to be the most effective for us. Some may say that we're using too many tools. I think it's just enough. We're able to work through all of these tools one by one and get what we need out of each one. The most exciting one, I think, has been Miro. We've been able to see a bump in our productivity as we've been able to visualize our work. And so thank you for going over that, Laura. I do want to talk a bit about our lessons learned, though. And so we've learned a lot about empathy. We meet on a daily basis, and that allows for making sure we are all doing all right before we dive into our work. So March of 2020, April of 2020, I'm sure all of us remember those times when a lot was highly uncertain. But the one thing that was certain for us is that we were going to meet at 9:30 in our stand-up room, and that remains the case today. And so there was a lot of comfort in that. We found out a lot about our work. We did a lot of work together in those meetings. So from these daily check-ins, we have developed a rapport and a more comprehensive understanding of each other's work, which will certainly outlast this digital library migration. In talking about moving forward, we have been able to achieve a lot in a relatively short period of time. We were also able to quickly shift to remote operations during the pandemic without a drop in productivity. This way of working allowed us to make the most out of a difficult situation, or a vat of lemons. So just to talk a bit about teamwork, I feel like all of us have felt over the course of this past year that teamwork is most effective when it is prioritized over solitary work when possible. We do work somewhat independently during our sprints, but we found that working together provides a sizable productivity boost, often much more than expected. And so just to talk a bit about our challenges, team changes are a challenge. We've experienced several adjustment periods. We've had multiple people that have left us. One in particular who's on this call that we greatly miss our candy bowl. That's a whole nother conversation. But that brought joy to us when we were in the building together. I also want to highlight the Zoom fatigue is real. And it is important to highlight that and validate that. Zoom is tiring. We do live in a world that values overwork, and in this remote environment, that means over Zooming. I would also like to mention that this way of working is not for everyone or for every team, but if your team can work through those storming phases, the payoff is substantial. We found that breaks between sprints were useful, and we're on a sprint break right now, and we pick up next week. It's also important to get buy-in from people who are not familiar with this project management approach. In summary, the challenges are worth it. The team and the work are better because of them. And I would like to hand this back over to Bethany.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jarrell. So really quickly, our next steps on the BC Dams project. We are currently migrating collections from CONTENTdm into our new repository. We are just over 50% right now. And we achieved all of that in 2020. We started at the beginning and we were able to really focus and get a lot done. Our next milestone is 70%, and then we will have our full release. So at that point, we will start promoting the new system more widely and begin phasing out CONTENTdm even more. And then at 100%, we will sunset CONTENTdm altogether. And along the way, we will continue doing development work, adding more features and doing user testing. We have come up with a lot of great ideas as we have been working together, and we are excited to continue our progress. And so I believe that is about it. Thank you very much. And we look forward to answering your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you all so much. We're going to move over to the next presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris Jordan at Texas Advanced Computing Center.
Hello, everyone. I am Chris Jordan from the Texas Advanced Computing Center, and I'm going to briefly introduce the ISOBank project, and then I will pass it over to my collaborator, Anna Dabrowski, to talk about some of the details and do a quick demo. So the ISOBank project came from kind of a long process of community discussion. I think when the people in the community talk about it, they date it back to about 2013 when they started basically coming to a collective feeling as people who created and used data about stable isotopes in their research, that they needed a common infrastructure to preserve this data and to organize it. And this included both data that they're generating in the present day that they anticipated generating in the future as analysis tools got better, and also a rich body of historical data. This data has been generated, I think, for more than 100 years now, and there really is no kind of collective effort up until now to organize this or to preserve it for the future. So the work I'm going to talk about today is primarily coming from a National Science Foundation funded 3-year project that we proposed in collaboration with a number of members of the research community. And it was explicitly a multidisciplinary, community-focused effort to build this digital infrastructure that would be a common storage, search, and access infrastructure for all of this stable isotope data. And we talk about the data is basically the simple measurements of percentages or amounts of specific stable isotopes within material samples. But in order to find and use that data, there is an enormous amount of metadata that you need to describe where did the data come from, what was the context that you did the sample in, all of those kinds of things. And there were a large number of disciplines that are involved in generating and using this data, and whom we consulted in organized subcommittees to help us to develop the metadata schema for this. Ecology is a big one, paleontology and archaeology, organismal biology and environmental sciences. That's kind of the way that we broke it down. I don't think that's an exhaustive list of every discipline and subdiscipline that would describe themselves as involved in this. And then there's kind of a separate focus, and we had a separate committee addressing the needs of the analytical laboratories who create this data in the first place. And a lot of that is really focused on understanding the quality of the data and how it's generated, as that's an important component for the researchers who will use and particularly reuse this data, is to understand how trustworthy is it, or at least to have a context to develop their own understanding for that. So like I say, very early on, we kind of made the decision to do this in a very community involved way. So we formed these committees that were made up of people who are generating this data, who are using it on a regular basis. And we held a series of workshops, which initially were in person, more recently have been done remotely, to organize everybody, get them together, and basically just sit people down and have them talk about what should the metadata look like, and then to refine it after going back and thinking about it, and then giving us an opportunity to kind of ask more specific questions about how does this work in the technical context of a repository. And one of the things that I think was fairly clear early on in the process is that with all of these different disciplines and all of the different contexts that data come from in the research communities, we couldn't possibly describe the whole context of all of these things. And so the focus is really on what is it that's absolutely necessary to understand what is this data, where did it come from, to make it possible for people to find it, and then to find more information about it, and to develop ways to link out to other sources of information to provide fuller context for people that want to do deeper kind of investigation. And so we spent, probably about a year of just basically coming up with big lists of these potential metadata fields, and then probably another year of really nailing down the details of the controlled vocabularies that would go into them. What were the parameters for each one of these metadata elements, and what was going to be absolutely required versus what we would strongly encourage people to provide to us, and then what was just purely optional. And even after all of that, we have to acknowledge that this is not a process that can ever be done, partially because research is always evolving, the technology is always evolving. There will always be new needs and new ideas about what's necessary, but also that these are different communities who have needs that are sometimes in tension with each other. And the one thing that we can't do is just always add more metadata because people say that they want it, because we would very quickly get up to thousands or tens of thousands of metadata fields. And so we have to develop ways to kind of mediate between all of the needs of the different communities that are involved with this. So I'll pass it over to Anna now to talk about the data creation and the metadata in more detail.
Great, thank you, Chris. So before we get into metadata, I wanted to start with kind of a description of how isotopic data are created. And this is a description that we developed by talking to the researchers. So this is kind of speaking generally and simplifying greatly. It's what we learned from conversations with these committees about the process of generating isotopic measurements from samples. And this is kind of the process that we've used to help inform our metadata schema for ISOBank as well. So researchers usually start with something that they collect. So this could be something like water or plankton that they're collecting out in the field, or it could be something like an animal skeleton that they're acquiring from a museum. These collected samples are then stored in specific ways, and then they undergo various sorts of treatments. So this could be something like subsampling. For example, if a researcher is working with a skull, they might take a tooth from that skull. And then they also do various different chemical processing steps to ultimately generate some sort of an analytical sample. And basically this analytical sample is material that's in a tube that can be handed over to an analytical lab. These analytical labs then use a mass spectrometer that will destructively analyze the samples in order to produce some kind of stable isotope measurements. And that would be something like a measure of the amount of carbon-13 isotope relative to carbon-12. So what I want to highlight here about this data creation process is the complexity that we encounter when we're dealing with researchers who have different sorts of projects and different kinds of samples that they're working with. And they're moving from having kind of one entity or sample that they collect, and that sample is then being transformed into one or more different derivative products at various points in their process. So for example, a researcher might be working with a skull. They might then take a tooth from that skull, maybe an eye from that skull. They'll do some sort of a treatment, and then they'll have all sorts of samples that they generate from those materials that they then send to an analytical lab. The other part that is more complicated here is also that we have multiple parties involved. So we have both investigators or researchers as well as analytical labs. And both of these different groups have important information about these samples and how they've been handled that we need to make sure that we have in our system. Next slide, please. So in designing a metadata schema for ISOBank, we focused on these steps and how a sample changes as it's being processed in order to generate a measurement. So starting with the measurement as kind of the fundamental piece of information here, that's the data that's being generated for a particular sample by an analytical lab. And that's a measurement of something, again, like the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12. That's the data that the researchers really want. That's the piece of information they want to know. But in order to make these measurements valuable and meaningful and comparable, researchers also need to know which compound or which sort of an analyte this measure comes from. So for example, is this measure from something like water or is it something like collagen? And how did the lab that conducted the analysis do its quality control, quality assurance? So for example, did they subset a sample and do multiple runs? Which standard materials did they use to calibrate? All these pieces of information are really fundamental to researchers understanding kind of what a piece of data means. And beyond that fundamental information, the data are only valuable if researchers can also understand how the sample was being prepared. So for example, if it's collagen, did that collagen come from a tooth or did it come from some other animal tissue? If it is a tooth, which tooth did it come from? Which species of animal did it come from? What method was used to extract the collagen from the tooth? All of these things can impact the measurement and the expected values. And so the researcher is really interested in knowing these kinds of pieces of information as well. And then further information is also necessary for the researchers to kind of understand the meaning of the data. And so that's information about how the sample was originally acquired, and it also informs how the data are interpreted. So for example, did that tooth come from a skull that a researcher acquired from a museum collection? Where is that museum collection? If researchers are dealing with something like sediment, where was that sediment collected? If they're dealing with something like rainwater, at what point in time and what date was that rainwater captured? So by grouping our metadata into these different areas as descriptive of parts of the process of stable isotope analysis, we were able to structure our conversations with the disciplinary experts and really focus them on which pieces of information were necessary in these different areas. And then we could aggregate the recommendations to define metadata fields that can handle multiple different disciplinary needs for describing the data and the context of its creation. And then finally, also dividing things in this way allowed us to incorporate fields from other metadata standards, such as Darwin Core, within relevant areas. So next slide. We tried to focus on identifying the required pieces of information for researchers to be able to assess the usability of a measurement or a piece of data, as Chris mentioned, and also for finding relevant pieces of data within a system that will ultimately publish large amounts of data. So for example, geospatial information about where a sample was collected is crucial both for interpreting the data and also an important field for search. In defining our metadata fields, we took advantage of several different tools in order to create a flexible schema that can then generate custom templates to meet the needs of various disciplines. So for example, we took advantage of having some required fields, and really what we tried to do was minimize the number of required fields to the core information that researchers across different disciplines would need to provide for their data. We also have recommended fields for preferred or valuable information that can't necessarily be required for reasons such as legacy data, which might not have this kind of information. And we also have optional fields for additional information and some disciplinary specific information. One neat thing that we've incorporated as well is conditional fields. So we have fields that in our metadata schema that are conditionally recommended and required based on the values within other fields. So this allows us to add logic where a specific material type or specific discipline can help inform which other metadata fields might be required or recommended for that particular sample. So for example, we've tried to lay this out a little bit in the diagram below, where we have two different material types that might be chosen. For example, at the top, we have sediment, and then at the bottom, we have tooth. And then depending on the material type that a researcher may choose for their sample, They would then be guided to having a recommended or required additional field. So for sediment, that would be something like sediment particle class. And for tooth, that might be something like dental element. Many of our fields are free text description fields, but we've also spent a lot of time with the community in establishing agreement on terms that can be used for things like material type within a material type hierarchy, as well as lists. So for example, lists of treatment steps that are common practice, as well as things like dental elements, where you see an example here of incisor being one of the controlled terms. We also control whether fields are repeatable or can only be used once, and include validation for things like numbers and dates. And then finally, another neat feature is that we're able to link with other systems to look up additional information. So for example, we do have a scientific name field for organismal samples, which is currently a text field so that ISOBank doesn't have to also manage a taxonomy. However, the information that's provided within this field will automatically be looked up within the Global Biodiversity Information Faculty Taxonomy. That's the GBIF taxonomy. And we pull in additional information. So from the scientific name, we're also able to get an identifier. We're able to get common names associated with that particular scientific name. And then all that information can also be used for search within the ISOBank platform. Next slide. So now it's time to do a brief demo of two different interfaces within the ISOBank system. So first, I'm going to show you our metadata editing interface. Let me get my screen share up. All right. So this is our administrative interface for editing our metadata fields. And within this interface, we're able to define all those different characteristics of the metadata fields that I went through in my slide. So we're looking here at the material type field. We have the name of the field, and we also have the column name of the field that will appear in a template that researchers need to fill in with their metadata. This is also where we can define the value type for the field. So this metadata field takes a tree, which is a hierarchy, but it could also be just a plain text field. It could be a date field or a lookup field that has controlled terms. In this interface, we're also able to define whether or not this field can only be used once or if it can be used many times. And we can also determine whether or not this field is required, recommended, conditionally required, or recommended based on the values in another field. Material type is one of our required fields, and it's fundamental, and we have various other fields that are conditionally recommended or required based on this one. We can also have our descriptions for the metadata field here and examples of its use and more detailed descriptions that we get from the community. And I also wanted to show you, here we have the hierarchy of terms that are valid for this field. So we have a particular value, and then we know the parent of that value as well. So once we define a field here, if we make any changes, these changes will dynamically percolate throughout the system. And what I mean by this is when we have a change made here in this interface, and we move into the template generator for researchers, we'll see those changes take effect. So what we're looking at now is the template generator, which allows researchers to specify what kind of metadata is relevant for their particular kind of sample. So on this interface, a researcher would choose what kind of measurement they're taking. So for example, we talked about carbon isotopes. Perhaps they're measuring carbon. And then they can go in and help to describe what their sample is in order to inform which other metadata fields may be required or recommended for their particular sample type. So we see here that we have material type, and this is a required field, which is checked, and it's grayed out so it can't be unchecked. We can go in here and select values from those controlled terms that were defined in the other interface. And if we go in and we choose tooth as our material type, we will also have other fields that become required. So we have material specific information. And for something like tooth, we have dental element that is now a required field. Once researchers have chosen the fields that are relevant for their particular data, they can scroll all the way to the bottom here and download a template. And these templates are used to fill in the data that they have, as well as the appropriate metadata. Once those are filled in, they can then be uploaded into the ISOBank system, and their data will then be within the system. All right, back to the presentation. So we now have a fully functioning system with metadata fields defined in the system, but our work on the metadata needs to continue, and we still face many challenges, especially as researchers start to use this new system. So some of our big questions are, how much is enough information for finding data and for data reuse? The metadata fields that we've incorporated so far were defined in the abstract with collaboration from these committees. But now these fields have been implemented within a living system, and we have to see if the logic and the rules still behave the way that actually captures the intended information. And we also expect to identify areas where we might have missed information that is relevant when we're dealing with real data. We also need to approach how much is too much to ask from researchers. The model that we have is already quite complex, and ISOBank doesn't necessarily need to be the place to capture all the descriptive information about something like a collected sample. As Chris mentioned, we do want to link out to other sources of information as well. One of our major challenges is also in designing a schema that has an interface that's also flexible and intuitive enough to accommodate many different disciplines. So we've started to work on shared vocabularies, but these will continue to be a challenge because the norms vary across different communities, and they'll be difficult to establish and agreed upon terms with definitions that are appropriate across the board. The metadata fields that we have here include a few required fields, and although our committees have expressed a desire to have more information that's required and useful to understanding the data, this isn't always possible, especially because a lot of the data that we'll get may be new data, but some of it may also be legacy data that might not have the same detailed information. And finally, we need to continue working with the community to adjust these fields and their definitions and descriptions, as well as add new fields. So we expect to continue getting comments and feedback from community, and at some point we'll need to begin determining a more formal process for if and when it's appropriate to make changes to these fields. And now I'll pass it back to Chris to continue talking about developments for the ISOBank software system.
So I will, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and skip this slide because it mostly is also repeated on the following slide, which is primarily focused on lessons learned from this overall project. So one of the key things is kind of understanding what the goals of the overall infrastructure and what you're trying to accomplish with the metadata is. So, you know, in our case, even though we have a lot of metadata, we're not trying to be comprehensive in describing everything about the samples and the context of the samples. And that actually does allow us to exclude a lot. And I've listed a number of the kind of potential goals that may be important to you in building up your infrastructure and your metadata. And in particular, you know, understanding the disciplinary approaches and which disciplines you're trying to serve and what purposes you're trying to serve in those disciplines. Also, one of the kind of challenges we're wrestling with now is publication requirements and the needs of researchers to have DOIs or some kind of persistent handle that they can reference. This is very important now in getting folks to deposit data under open data kinds of mandates. They want a DOI that they can give out to people to say, look, I shared my data, it's open, it's accessible here. But there's also questions for us, and I think for any kind of research data, about what does a DOI get attached to, or what groups of things do DOIs get attached to. And of course, there are costs associated with building and maintaining the infrastructure for that. And then for us, certainly, and I think for anybody dealing with research data, understanding what the other kind of external sources of contextual information are going to be, and what relationship you want to have to them. How do you want to link to them? How much of that data do you want to be able to incorporate into your presentation? Do you want to incorporate that dynamically, or just have a link where people can follow and say, oh, I want more information, I'll go to another site to do that? And then, of course, getting the community on side, getting the community to collaborate with you and see it as a shared project, rather than us kind of off in a corner building something and then bringing it and saying, here, use this, give us all your data. That's a really key kind of point for us, and it continues to be, especially as we're asking a lot from researchers in terms of describing their data and giving us the full metadata that's needed to make the data truly reusable across disciplines. And with that, I think I can wrap up, and if we have time for any questions, we'll be happy to take them.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our presenters. I know at the beginning of this, I said that we would wrap up around 3:50, so I'd like to find a way to honor that. I don't see any Q&As, questions in the Q&A tab. I know that Jarrell mentioned Zoom fatigue, and I'm wondering if after 3 days of conferencing, we're all feeling that a little bit, because it is almost 4 o'clock on Wednesday. So if there aren't any questions from the audience, I'm just going to pause for a moment so people can collect themselves. I'm going to say that if you have any questions, I hope you'll reach out to our speakers. These were such dense projects, and I was really excited to hear about them. I do not want to keep us on the call any longer than we need to be on the call. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to drop a link to a post conference survey for TDL, and I hope everyone goes and spends some time with a plant or a pet or some nature. So thank you, and I hope to see you next year.
Thank you for moderating too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.